The illusion of unity. How the European Union became a tool of globalist power, the European Union, presented as a visionary step toward unity and peace, was in reality the brainchild of political figures with imperial aspirations disguised as integration. Leaders like Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, Helmut Kohl, and François Mitterrand were not merely bureaucrats with idealistic dreams. They were men with grand designs for a post-national Europe, one powerful enough to counter the United States on the global stage. By using anti-American sentiment and the perceived helplessness of individual European nations under the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, they justified a radical transformation of Europe into a single economic entity. The creation of the euro in 1999 was a cornerstone of this plan, intended to rival the US dollar and empower Europe to negotiate collectively. However, the euro was born with a critical flaw: its artificial overvaluation. Initially intended as a 1.1 competitor to the US dollar, it entered the markets with a value more than 30% higher than the dollar. This overvaluation severely damaged the competitiveness of European exports and economies that relied on affordable labor and production. Countries like Italy, Greece, and Spain, formerly able to adjust their currencies in times of hardship, were suddenly locked into a rigid monetary structure. The result was immediate inflation, stagnating wages, and the erosion of the European middle class. National governments could no longer tailor economic policy to their population's needs. Instead, they became administrators of austerity, beholden to Brussels and the European Central Bank. Behind the noble rhetoric of integration, the European Union increasingly came under the sway of entrenched financial interests. Brussels, rather than serving the democratic will of Europe's peoples, became a technocratic fortress run by unelected bureaucrats and lobbyists. The Rothschild family, in collaboration with financial empires like those of the Rockefellers and J.P. Morgan, exerted growing influence through control of central banks, lobbying networks, and multinational corporations. Viktor Orbán of Hungary remains one of the few European leaders openly challenging this system, which has prioritized banking interests, corporate consolidation, and war-making over the welfare of ordinary citizens. The war in Ukraine has served as a stark example of this agenda in action. While framed as a defense of democracy, the conflict has provided an excuse for unprecedented military spending, energy market manipulation, and further integration of Europe into NATO's war machinery. European citizens are once again paying the price, this time through skyrocketing energy bills, food inflation, and a declining standard of living. The architects of EU policy are not held accountable for the economic destruction because they serve interests that profit from chaos: arms manufacturers, fossil fuel giants, and investment banks that benefit from war-related speculation and public debt. This descent into chaos has not been accidental. It has been a calculated Machiavellian strategy orchestrated primarily by the United States and the Anglo-Saxon power bloc. Using NATO and the Ukraine conflict as levers, Washington pushed Europe into a confrontation with Russia, knowing full well that such a clash would sever Europe's access to cheap Russian energy, the very foundation of its industrial strength. Nowhere has this betrayal been more evident than in Germany. Once the industrial engine of the European Union, Germany has seen its manufacturing sector hollowed out as energy prices tripled following the imposition of sanctions. These sanctions, far from weakening Russia, devastated Europe's ability to remain competitive on the global stage. To compound the farce, European countries continued to import Russian oil and gas covertly through intermediaries at inflated prices, paying more for the same product while pretending to uphold a moral stand. In a profound geopolitical miscalculation, the strategy of sanctions and tariffs against Russia, China, and increasingly Turkey has produced the opposite of its intended effect. Rather than weakening these nations, Western economic aggression forced them to accelerate domestic industrial development, strengthen trade partnerships outside of the Western sphere, and invest in technological self-sufficiency. Russia quickly redirected its energy exports to Asia, strengthened its banking sector, and reindustrialized in critical areas like agriculture and defense. China doubled down on its Belt and Road Initiative and domestic manufacturing, reducing its dependence on Western technology. Turkey, targeted through currency warfare and sanctions, responded by ramping up domestic defense production, expanding its regional influence, and solidifying trade ties with non-Western blocs such as BRICS and the Organization of Turkic States. These countries are now growing at rates that expose the failure of sanctions as a tool of economic control. In attempting to isolate them, the West instead accelerated the birth of a multipolar world economy. At the core of this decaying Western model is a fraudulent financial system. Central banks, largely privatized or operating under minimal public oversight, create money from nothing and lend it to governments at interest. This perpetual debt cycle ensures that sovereignty is sacrificed at the altar of financial dependency. The Rothschilds, Rockefellers, and their peers do not merely influence policy. They own the structures through which policy is made. They dominate the financial institutions that lend to states, the corporations that shape public opinion, and the networks that dictate global trade and military alliances. The European Union, far from being a beacon of post-war peace and unity, has become a captive institution, a mechanism for consolidating power among a narrow class of transnational elites. The economic catastrophe facing the continent today is not the result of mismanagement, but of deliberate design. Inflation, debt, war, and deindustrialization are not failures of the system, but tools of control. Meanwhile, the rest of the world has begun to break free from the globalist grip. Until this globalist machine is dismantled and sovereignty returned to the people of Europe, the Union will remain what it has become, an empire of illusion, ruled not by citizens, but by creditors and warmongers.